Well, our scripture lesson today comes from 2 Corinthians chapter 11. Paul is being attacked, and so as he defends himself and explains his ministry, I pick it up at verse 23. Are they servants of Christ? I'm out of my mind to talk like this. I am more. I have worked much harder, been in prison more frequently, been flogged more severely, been exposed to death again and again. 5 times I received from the Jews the 40 lashes minus 1. 3 times was beaten with rods. Once I was stoned. 3 times I was shipwrecked. I spent a night and a day in the open sea. I have been constantly on the move. I've been in danger from rivers, in danger from bandits, in danger from my own countrymen, in danger from the Gentiles, in danger in the city, in danger in the country, in danger at sea, in danger from false brothers. I have labored and toiled and have often gone without sleep. I have known hunger and thirst and have often gone without food. I've been cold and naked. And besides everything else, I face the daily pressure of my concern for all the churches. Who is weak and I do not feel weak? Who is led into sin and I do not inwardly burn? This is the word of the Lord. Boy, what a story that one is, huh? Today I want to talk to you about your story. Last week I was strategizing about the virtual church project with an old colleague, and she asked me, what are you preaching on? I said, well, I'm doing a little legacy theme. And she says, oh, you need to read the book, A Million Miles in 1,000 Years by Donald Miller. She said, when I got done with that book, I wanted to bicycle across America and kayak into Canada. I said, wow, where'd you hear about this cool book? She said, your daughter recommended it to me. And last week I talked about us leaving a legacy. And really, the kind of legacy you leave is going to be determined by your life story. So what's your story? Sometimes people will ask, like when you get in trouble at school and you come home and your parents say, okay, what's the story? Other times we're sitting down and chatting with people and we're sharing our story. Sometimes we're passing our story on to our kids or maybe our grandkids. One day we're going to be in a retirement home exchanging our tales. I was surprised to learn that retirees on cruise ships have an unsaid rule. They don't talk about what they did for a living. They want to talk about the other elements of their lives. And hopefully for all of us, we're not going to end up like the last scene in Catcher in the Rye where he's telling his story to a counselor at a nut house. So how do you know if you have a good story to tell? Oh, let's be honest. If you watched a movie about a guy who wanted a Volvo and worked years to get it, you wouldn't cry at the end when he drove it off the lot. Okay, that would not be a story that you would remember. And yet, we spend years actually living such a story and then wonder why our lives are not more meaningful. And I think the saddest thing about life is you don't remember half of it. Or maybe the real problem is our life isn't memorable enough to recall much of it. You know how we go through the daily routine and endure it. What if we got to the end of life with nothing to show for it? Now, I know I've shared with you before the last conversation I had with a friend before cancer took him into unconsciousness. He said, I spent my whole life scheming and I have nothing to show for it. Or how about the philosophers when they say life is meaningless? I wonder if what they're really saying is their lives are meaningless, and as they realize their existence is unremarkable, they project their dreary lives onto us. I mean, let's be honest. The certainty of death gives each one of us in our human story a dramatic tension. That infamous dash between the dates of our birth and death, that's our story. And when I do funerals, I try to catch the essence of a person's story. I remember once I said to the family members, tell me about your loved one. And they said, she liked to watch TV and eat bonbons. Well, give me a little bit more. And there wasn't any more. And I'm not trying to attack that person. Maybe the family just wasn't that articulate, or they were overwhelmed with grief and couldn't reflect at that time. Maybe that's all she was capable of. But let's be honest, how many of us have relatives whose stories are powerful, and when they died, their funeral was among the most meaningful you've ever been to? You know you've encountered a great life story because you go home and you start to ponder your own life story. And when it's a good story, the sadness is at the funeral is because their story was not finished. I mean, if you're not living a good story, nobody thinks you died too soon. We say, too bad she died with plans still unfinished. And I say, good for her. I pity the person who stopped dreaming and contributing before they stopped breathing. Now, there are principles a musician adheres to in order to make music. Otherwise, it's just noise. I think it's the same with our life stories. If we don't engage certain principles, our stories are just random experiences. There needs to be a storyline. And the elements that make for a meaningful story in a book or on the screen are the same that make for a meaningful life. You see, a good story is a character who wants something and has to overcome conflict to obtain it. And by the way, Christians, we have a serious obstacle to overcome. It's called the ramifications of sin, which require Jesus' death on the cross and requires the ongoing help of the Holy Spirit. I remember when I was a young seminarian, I went to a conference where the speaker talked about his life in Laguna Beach, and his Jaguar, and his successful ministry, all the things that I wanted. But I noticed that beyond it seeming like he was bragging, there were no God elements in his ministry story. And while I wanted his success, I didn't really like or want his story. You see, if our story's not big enough to require God, then really it's a weak story. I mean, great stories, they include overcoming conflict, which might be where our stories break down as we're reluctant to embrace the potential greatness of the story we're in. I wonder if one of the reasons we fail to acknowledge the brilliance of life is because we don't want the responsibility inherent with that awareness. We don't want to be characters in an epic story because then, well, courage and strength are involved, and, you know, our lives do better under the radar where we're unremarkable and we don't have to have an epic approach. We'd rather be unwilling victims rather than grateful participants. Kind of like Moses when God said, lead my people out of slavery. And he said, you know, I'd prefer to just attend the sheep, thank you. And sometimes we assume God is unjust because challenges touch our lives, when actually he's a master storyteller. You know, as God wrote the world's history, it says in Genesis 1:2 that the Spirit hovered over the darkness and the depth. And I imagine that God sat over the dark nothing and wrote you and me specifically into the story. I mean, that's what Ephesians 1:4 says. Before the foundation of the world was laid, he knew you. And he put us in with the sunset and the rainstorm, as though to say, enjoy your place in my story. The beauty of this means you matter. And you can create within it, even as I have created you. Well, again, the same elements that make a movie meaningful are the ones that make a life meaningful. I mean, doesn't a character have to face their greatest fears? And aren't most of our fears relational? I mean, it's the stuff of forgiveness and risking rejection and learning how to love. You know, we think of stories as obtaining money and security, but the truth isn't it that life all comes down to relationships? And once you know what it takes to make a better story, you don't really have a choice. Not living a better story would be like deciding to walk around numb until you die. This one man found his 13-year-old daughter had some marijuana, and she was also dating a guy whose vocabulary was limited to, yeah, no, whatever. Why do we have to come home so early? Well, Donald Miller asked, are you going to ground her and make her stop dating that guy? And the father said, you know, we tried that, but things only got worse at home. And then Miller pointed out, you know, she's living a terrible story. Well, when they bumped into each other 3 months later, Miller asked, how's your daughter doing? And the dad said, you know, after we talked, I couldn't sleep. I thought about the story my daughter was living and the role she played inside that story. I realized I have not provided a better role for my daughter. I haven't mapped out our story for our family. So my daughter chose another story in which she was wanted, even if she was only being used. In the absence of a family story, she has chosen a story in which there was adventure, rebellion, and independence. She's not a bad girl. She was just choosing the best story available to her. Donald Miller pictured his friend's daughter flipping through the channels of life, stopping at a story that seemed most compelling and offered her a role to play. And the dad continued, what I did was I stopped yelling at her, and I created a better story to invite her into. I went on the internet and did some research and found an organization that builds orphanages around the world. This sounded like a good ambition, something my family could do together. Sounded like a good story to me. Now, it cost $25,000 to build an orphanage. And to be honest, we just took out a second mortgage, and we don't have the money. But a good story involves risk. So I went home, I called a family meeting and told them about the village and the terrible thing happening to children and how the orphanage could change their lives. And I told them we are going to build an orphanage. But the family wasn't happy. The daughter's allowance was about to be curtailed. The wife didn't understand why he hadn't consulted her before he made this decision. And he explained to his wife, we aren't taking any risks. We aren't helping anyone. And our daughter is losing interest in the faith. Well, she hadn't spoken to him for a few days, and then suddenly she crawled up into their bed as she did when she was a kid and said, could we go to Mexico to see where they're going to build this orphanage? And maybe I could take some pictures of the kids and we could post them on my website and invite other people to help us out. Oh, and by the way, she broke up with her boyfriend. She forgot who she was for a little while. You see, the point of a story is character transformation. And that's the point of life, character transformation. You see, life is designed to change us so that we evolve from one kind of person into another. For the Christian, it's to rid ourselves of the old nature and put on Christ's attitude and approach. And it's true, the grip of sin is strong upon us, but friends, Christ's Spirit is stronger. And the question is, are we creating the person we want to be? A person with a story worth retelling. Because if not, you can recreate your story. I mean, think about it. In stories, the character is what he does. And the question is, who is this person at the core of your life? When you look within, what do you find? Are you loving or are you cruel? Are you generous or are you selfish? Are you strong or are you weak? Truthful or a liar? Courageous or cowardly? You see, the only way to know the truth is to observe the choices we make when we're under pressure. And how many of us pontificate about how we would have handled a situation? Or we sit back and daydream about what our lives would be like. But in the meantime, we are empty of any real stories. There's no evidence of an actual character living an inspiring life. And friends, it's an odd feeling to be awakened from a fantasy and look at a bare mantle haunted by nothingness, an absence of what could have been or should be now. You know, our life story, it always sounds like a great idea. And we get excited about it, and then comes time to do the work, and suddenly we stop. You see, the joy of an accomplishment requires the pain of striving to get there. And people tend to fear the mountain they have to climb before them, the changes that are required to attain what it is they're seeking. You know, there's this odd phenomenon where women who are in domestic abuse situations will return to their abuser. Why? Because they're familiar with it. They're afraid to choose a better story because making a change represents variables that are out of their control. And you need to know, great stories don't give in to fear. Now, one of the most often repeated statements in the Bible is, do not fear. You see, what fear does is it lures us into living a boring life, playing it cautious, and not seizing opportunity so the big might occur through us. And friends, I want to remind you that there's a master writer outside of us who's plotting a better story for you. You know that still small voice in Isaiah 30:21 that whispers the difference between right and wrong, that reveals the subtle delineation between the beautiful and the profane? It's not an agitated voice. It's ever patient as it endures a million false starts. It's the voice of wisdom that guides us, saying, hold your tongue. Don't talk to that person that way. Forgive your friend. Don't look at that woman as a possession. Call that person who's hurting. It's the voice that says, slow down, I want you to see the sunset. Or reminds us how short life is and how our troubles aren't really worth worrying about because I've got you covered. Well, there's also a force in the world, an antagonist who doesn't want us to live a good story, doesn't want us to face our issues or bring something meaningful into the world through our lives. It's the force behind the statement that life isn't worth living. And God allows these dark forces to enter our world. One woman had a rough relationship with God. Her marriage went bad, and her daughter had endured a bunch of negativity because of that. It was all happening in her personal life at the same time the Rwandan genocide was taking place. And she fumed, why is God's world so crazy? What does it even matter that Jesus died on the cross? Well, then she had an opportunity to go to Rwanda, where she saw the genocide museum that explained the colonialism and the confusion of identity created by the British occupation that fed into the tribal tensions that resulted in the genocide. And she went to a church where the Tutsis hid, thinking they would be safe in God's house. And instead, that's exactly where they got slaughtered by machetes, cutting out the hands of mothers who covered their children's eyes as they slashed into the kids' faces. And when the woman saw the bones lying against the wall in the church, she was so angry with God, she was going to offer her last prayer. If this is the kind of world you run, I don't believe in you. And just as she was starting into her denouncement, the Lord interrupted her. He gave her an overwhelming sense of tenderness, saying, this is what happens when people walk away from me. This is what happens when my love is expelled from a place. And she realized it's when people do not allow God to show up through them that the world collapses in upon itself. You know, most Americans, we don't live a good story. It's because marketing has manipulated the elements of our story. You know, your life is not complete unless you have this new car, or that new refrigerator, or that new stereo. And so we spend our lives acquiring what Madison Avenue says we need in order to be happy. And then we acquire and we acquire, and we get to the end of our life and it had no meaning. Enormous damage is created by the myth of utopia, the idea that you could be happy if you just had this or that. You know, I was surprised to find out that Denmark is the happiest place on earth. Why? Because the residents have low expectations. They look at life realistically. There's no expectation that that person or that possession is going to make them happy. An American said, Denmark's the happiest place, I want to move there. And the Dane said, don't. It won't work for you. And let's be honest, growing up in church, aren't we taught that Jesus is the answer to all our problems? You know, the apostles never said that Jesus is going to make everything here on earth perfect. In fact, Jesus himself said, in this world you will have tribulations. Can you imagine the Apostle Paul in an infomercial? Let me tell you what Jesus can do for you. Not with the resume I read to you. That's not what he'd say. And here's the problem. When our trials persist, we become vulnerable. And sometimes a lie gets whispered into our ears that has the power to shrink time into what seems like an eternal end of all things. You're never going to be right with God. You're always going to be alone. You are unlovable. And those words go into our heads and they sink into our hearts, and we stop living our stories. You know, Viktor Frankl, he was a neurologist that was thrust into a Nazi concentration camp. And the madness caused so many people just to commit suicide. And interfering with suicides was against the rules that was prohibited by the guards. But Frankl would do it anyways. He'd whisper into his struggling companion's ears, in the midst of this absurdity, your life still has meaning because we're part of a bigger story. And friends, I want you to know we have a role to play in a bigger story. Freud, he said that humanity's greatest pursuit was pleasure, but Frankl said it's meaning. You see, meaning pushes us past the pain of life to the ultimate truth that our story counts, that our life has meaning. And when you and I put eternity on the horizon, suddenly we're aiming at something that gives our life meaning. I mean, how often do we worship at the altar of romantic completion? Maybe that's why couples fight so much. They want their spouse to validate and affirm them. And when it doesn't happen, they just change the story. But maybe when you stop expecting people to be perfect, you can like them for who they are. Maybe when you quit expecting material possessions to satisfy you, you'll start to enjoy what you have. Maybe when you stop expecting God to remove all your troubles, you'll be surprised at how much you like spending time with Jesus. You see, we've all been duped into a counterfeit story. But every single one of us here has been made in the image of God. In fact, your story is not your own. It's God's story being told through you. And his story is that the love of Jesus Christ can overcome any form of evil on this earth. And I guess for you and me, that means that at any time we can change our story. You know, this one man's daughter was going to the prom, and she was all excited about the event and the flowers and the dress. She bought her dress and brought it home and paraded in front of her dad, who was watching Sports Center. And he acknowledged and smiled and said, yeah, that's nice. And she just then moved on. Her mother and her went upstairs. And he realized, you know what, I mismanaged the moment. I should have told her how beautiful she was and what a princess she is to me. And as he went back to looking at the scores on Sports Center, he decided to change the situation. He turned the TV off. He went into his closet. He put a suit on. He got a camera. He went and knocked on her door. Daughter said, what are you doing in a suit? And Mom's sitting there with pins in her lips. He said, Mom, I want you to take a picture of me and my daughter because I want to look good to match her dress. And then they spent some time dancing together and telling stories about when they went to the prom and invested in her exciting moment. And friends, the Lord is inviting you and me into an exciting story. It's a story that impacts not only this world, but eternity. And if each one of us allowed God to speak through our stories, I want you to realize you'd have the power of Almighty God and his agenda of goodness pouring forth through you. Oh, sure, Satan's going to be rolling marbles under our feet. But greater is he that is in you than he that is in this world. And I want to tell you that once God enters your story, you can't go back to being normal. You can't go back to meaningless scenes stitched together by the forgettable threads of wasted time. I mean, let's be honest. How many of you, when I read Paul's story, said, no, thank you? And yet, he raised the dead. And when poisonous snakes would bite him, didn't even bother him. He went to the third level of heaven. And Jesus moving through him, he literally changed the world. You and I have to make a decision. Is it give me an easy life and a peaceful death? Or maybe it's, God, thank you for the tough times that caused me to see you move in my life. Last thought. You become like the characters you interact with. If your friends are living boring stories, you probably are too. And don't we teach our children good and bad, what's worth living for and what's worth dying for, what's worth pursuing? You know what, friends? Our church doesn't want to be a nice little chapel on the side of the road of a nice little town. No, we have an agenda to get out globally with the word of Jesus Christ and the difference he can make in this world. We got the Hope Center that we're hoping to duplicate in other places. We have a passion to let God use our resources, our network, our lives, and do something big and create a story worth telling to the nations. That's the kind of church you just joined. That's the kind of church we are. I want to remind some of you, that's the kind of Christian we're called to be. Let's change our story. Amen? Friends, I went over time, so we're not going to sing the final hymn.